I'm going to show you a series of images. See if you notice anything strange. Did you notice anything? Did you see any faces? Did some of those images even seem to convey some kind of specific emotion? If so, you're not alone. This is an extremely pervasive aspect of how we perceive. And it even has a name. It's called pareidolia. We are hardwired to see human faces everywhere. In an electrical socket, in a random outcropping of rocks on Mars. We see faces everywhere. Today we're going to talk about visual object recognition and mental imagery. How do we break down and recognize what we're seeing? What kinds of operations do we perform on imagistic mental representations? How do we use visual information to construct an image of the world around us? Let's start by talking about object recognition. How do we actually recognize objects? This is a pretty important part of how we navigate the world. I need to be able to look at objects and be able to tell if something is food or not food. That's probably the most basic and most important function that I have as an organism. Navigating my daily life, it's important for me to know whether I'm about to pick up a permanent marker or a dry erase marker. How many whiteboards have been ruined? So how do we actually recognize objects? What are the steps we take to determine what an object is? What kind of mental representations do we generate? And how do we manipulate those representations? Well, we're going to need some kind of model for visual object recognition. We're going to talk about representations. What's the form of the representation that we generate when we're trying to recognize an object? And we're going to talk about operations, because remember, what are computations if not operations performed over representations? So we're going to compare different sorts of algorithms for a very specific type of information processing task. The goal of object recognition. So here we're going to stay above the implementational level. We're going to focus on representations and processes. So we're going to stay right at that algorithmic level to talk about how we represent the information we get through our eyes and how we use that to recognize objects in the outside world. One model that can explain how we recognize objects is called template matching. Template matching says that we recognize objects by comparing visual input, some kind of visual image, to a template formed by past experience, which also takes the form of a mental image. So the representational type here is imagistic. It's an imagistic representation. And the operation that we're performing to recognize the object is some kind of direct comparison. Maybe even just overlaying the image of what we're seeing now with the image from our memory. The goal here is to take an input and then classify it. Does it fall into a category that I already have stored in memory? So if I see an animal on my balcony, I want to know, is that a bird? Is it a cardinal? I'm very interested in seeing cardinals. I like cardinals a lot. So I might take the image of what I'm seeing now, and I'll take whatever examples of cardinals I've seen in the past, and I'll compare them directly and see, how closely does this match what I'm seeing right now? I think this is kind of an intuitively appealing sort of model, taking what we know, what we've experienced in the past, and comparing it very directly to what we're experiencing now. So the way template matching works, there's a stimulus in the world that generates a mental image. We take that input through our eyes, transduce it, and then use that to generate an imagistic mental representation. Take that mental image and compare that to previous mental images from previous encounters we've had with similar objects. And it's the direct comparison between those two mental images, those two imagistic representations, that can tell us whether what we're seeing matches what we've seen before or whether it's something novel. Now there are some issues here. What if we're seeing a new object from a unique angle? What if I've never seen it from this angle before? Does it have to match perfectly in order for me to recognize it? What if it has a different shape or size or color? There's a lot of variation in the world. There may be too much variation in the input. There may be too many variants of any given particular object for me to do a conclusive match. Think of recognizing a letter like the letter A. Well, letter A could be in any font, any of hundreds of different kinds of fonts, different font sizes. It can be printed in different media. It could be on a wood block. It could be printed on a page in a book. It could be digital on a screen. And each of those is going to look slightly different. And that's a very limited case. Real objects in the real world, like trees or animals or people, we are extremely variant. There's a high degree of variance between all of these things. And not just from one individual to another, but from one viewing angle to another. So we'd have to somehow account for all of that variation when we were doing this matching process. And it's not clear how effective that would be. Let's consider another model called recognition by components. This is a model that was endorsed by David Marr, you may remember from the levels of analysis. He was a vision neuroscientist, so he was very interested in how we recognize objects. The recognition by components theory says that when we view an object, we first break it down into 3D features to create a visual model. So the representation is not just a visual image. It is a visual image, but it's a visual image, an imagistic representation with very specific properties. It's actually a three-dimensional visual model. So this is like the difference between your computer showing you a JPEG, an image of something, versus rendering a three-dimensional model of something, like for a Pixar movie. So even though we're going to build a three-dimensional model, the input that we receive is still two-dimensional. Light hits our retina, and that gets transduced into an electrical signal that gets turned into an image. But the image that we're getting on the backs of our retinas is a two-dimensional image. It's a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object in the world. So somehow we're going to have to bridge that gap from two-dimensional image projected onto our retinas to some kind of three-dimensional visual representation in our minds. But it makes a lot of sense if we can do this, because what we really want is to be able to reconstruct what the object was in the world that caused that two-dimensional image to hit our retinas. And the thing in the world that's causing our perceptual event is a three-dimensional thing. So it makes sense that we would want to recreate a three-dimensional model of that thing in our minds. So there's going to have to be some series of operations here that can reconstruct a three-dimensional model from that two-dimensional input. And the way this is going to work is we're going to dissect the image into atomic units called geons and assemble those into a three-dimensional figure. So these geons, these are the primitive units of three-dimensional shapes. They have 3D features. They take forms of things like cubes and cylinders, pyramids and spheres. And we take those and we use those to reconstruct a model, not necessarily strictly an image, but a model that corresponds to the image that we are seeing. It's sort of like those drawing guides you may have seen when you were younger. How do you draw this character? You draw a big circle for the body and a circle for the head, and you draw tubes for arms and whatnot. And then at some point you can transform that into a more detailed and accurate drawing. But it gives you the basic structure to use these atomic units. There are several advantages of this model. One is view invariance. Geons are recognizable from any viewing angle. So once you have managed to construct a three-dimensional model, you can rotate it in your mind's eye and reposition it to see if it matches whatever you're seeing now. It's also resistant to visual noise. There's a certain amount of top-down processing involved here. We are reconstructing a three-dimensional model of a thing in the world. And so we're not so reliant on all of the details of the thing we are seeing. What's more important is the three-dimensional space that it inhabits, the way those three-dimensional geons come together and integrate with each other. One of the pieces of evidence that this is in fact how we process images comes from experiments like this. This is a series of images. On the left we have the raw images themselves, these very simple line drawings of 3D objects. And then on the right, we have the same images, but with some of the information removed, so that our brains will have to fill in that missing information. We'll have to do some top-down processing. But not all of these images are equally easy to reconstruct. Do you get the sense that the images in the B column are a little bit easier to figure out how they map to those original images than the images in the C column? The C column images seem more ambiguous. It's harder to tell what they're supposed to be. They're harder to reconstruct. Why is that? The question that we should ask is, what is being removed here and what is being preserved? In the B image, we have lines and Importantly, we have junctures that more closely correspond to geons. These are at the intersections of the edges. They are where the edges meet each other. So together they can help us project the entire 3D shape or fill it in. It's really important and meaningful to have those points of intersection. That can tell us what kind of 3D shape we should be reconstructing. In the C image, we don't have those intersection points. So we can't easily reconstruct the geons that the image is made of. The line segments don't help us project a 3D shape. That's at least one way of explaining why this task becomes easier when certain pieces of information are removed and not others. It could be because we are reconstructing it into some kind of atomic rudimentary geons, 3D shapes, to build that three-dimensional model. I have one more model that I wanted to share called feature integration. And feature integration is more about attention than about object recognition per se. Here we'll concentrate not just on recognizing a single shape as belonging to some category in isolation, but among other shapes. Essentially, how do we recognize objects in noise when there are other objects that will distract you? So this is all about attention. How do we direct our attention to solve the problem of recognizing an object when there are a lot of distractors? And feature integration is all about feature extraction and recombination. So instead of trying to match to a template, and instead of trying to deconstruct into three-dimensional geons, what we're going to do is we're going to break an image down into its visual features. And then we're going to perform a series of operations where we identify those features and then reintegrate them back together. So there are three stages to this. There's a pre-attentive stage, which is fast and automatic and effortless, where we can identify a single salient feature. So if there is a single feature among all those competing objects, we will be able to identify that very quickly, very effortlessly, very automatically. It does not require any directed attention. In the second stage, that's where we have to use our focused attention. This is a lot slower, it's more effortful. It requires directed attention. And this is where we're going to identify other important features and then integrate those features together into a visual representation that can help us recognize the object that we are looking for. And then stage 3 is object recognition. This is when we have reached our goal and we can recognize the object. So this model of feature integration, it is a model about object recognition, but it's also a model about how we find objects. We can think of this as sort of solving the Where's Waldo problem. How do we find Waldo in these chaotic scenes full of distracting information? Well, if he was different enough from everything else in the scene, we would be able to pull him out by identifying a single feature that contrasts with all of the other objects in that scene. And we would be able to do so in a way that would be very fast and automatic. It's the fact that Waldo actually shares so many features with so many other things in the scene that causes this to be such a slow and deliberate process. That's what induces the challenge of Where's Waldo? We can't immediately spot Waldo because he shares too many features with too many other things in the scene. Let's play a little game to see this in action. What I want you to do is I want you to find the red T. And pay attention to how hard it seems to find the red T among all of these red S's. Okay, that was not so bad. Pretty easy. What about now? I've added several more S's. Has it gotten more difficult, or does it still feel pretty easy? Okay, what about now? What did I change? There are still S's and T's, but now they're not all red anymore. They're mixed, too. So did this get a little bit harder? Probably. Now, instead of being able to identify that single salient feature, now there are two features you have to keep track of. Whether something is an S or a T, the shape, but also the color. So we don't get that pop-out effect. We can't immediately see the T. It takes a little more effort. Did it get a little bit harder again? by adding more and more t's and s's, it gets harder and harder now that there is more than one feature that we have to pay attention to. So these experiments imply that when we scan objects, we have to perform operations for each unique feature, for the shape, for the color, for any other features that we might introduce. So this model, feature integration, it's all about extracting features and then recombining them when there are lots of distractors. And it's much easier to discriminate an object among competitors if it only differs in one feature. It becomes much more difficult if there are more features. This is important because it illustrates a difference between two different ways of implementing algorithms. That single feature difference can be detected with what we call parallel search. You can actually scan all of the items in the scene at the same time, but only if there's a single feature difference. Whereas the multiple feature difference can only be detected with serial search. You have to scan each item one at a time. This gets at a core difference between serial processing and parallel processing. Serial processing is a type of processing where each step of the algorithm has to be taken consecutively. You have to scan one object at a time. You can only do one thing at a time. Parallel processing refers to algorithms where multiple steps can occur simultaneously. You can scan multiple objects all at the same time. So this is one of those open questions in cognitive science. Does our brain use parallel or serial processing? And what feature integration shows us is it really seems to depend on the task, and it seems to depend on the parameters of the task. So the real question is, when can we use parallel processing and when can we use serial processing? In this case, serial search is slow and effortful, right? You have to manually inspect every shape and evaluate it. You're paying attention to each letter one by one. Whereas parallel search is quick and easy, right? None of the tasks that you do in parallel is very difficult on its own, and you can solve this problem really quickly. So parallel processing definitely has some advantages. This is the advantage of speed. But it's not something we can do all of the time. Certain things will require more effort, and they will require us to do them one step at a time. Okay, so we've talked about several models of visual object recognition. Template matching theory, recognition by components, feature detection. These try to answer the question of what types of representations we build and how we manipulate them. And in all cases, the representation was some kind of mental image. But what does that entail? How do we manipulate mental imagery? I'm going to switch tracks a bit, and we're going to talk now about mental imagery itself and the types of transformations and operations we can apply to imagistic representations. So we can think of things as happening in our mind's eye, right? We all seem to have a mind's eye where we can view objects and scenes and people from our memory. And if we engage in introspection, we realize that our imaginations, for most of us, are pretty powerful. We can manipulate the image in our mind's eye. We can zoom in or zoom out. We can rotate the image. We can move through a scene. And all of these actions can be described as operations performed on mental representations. These are all fundamentally transformations on mental images or imagistic representations. So what kinds of operations can you perform with a mental image? Well, you can zoom in, you can pan across an image, you can scan looking for specific things. Imagine a scene containing objects of different sizes. You can zoom in on a particular object. Then you can zoom out to view the whole scene. Imagine a familiar landscape. You can pan across the landscape, viewing the whole scene in a sweeping motion, just the way that you would with a video camera. We can also rotate objects to perform identification tasks. Suppose you see something and you want to know if it matches something from another angle. We can take that thing in our mind's eye and we can rotate it to see if it matches. Remember recognition by components. The representation generated was an assembly of 3D shapes, of geons. So those mental images, they're not just images. They're actually three-dimensional objects that we can manipulate to view from any angle. And that explains view invariance, the idea that these mental images are invariant. So what can we deduce about these operations? How can we make inferences about the representations, the mental images, and the operations that are being performed on them. Let's do a little experiment. I'm going to show you an image of an elephant and a rabbit. Study the image for a few seconds, and then I'll ask you a question. Which way was the rabbit facing? If you said to the left, you are correct. I'm going to show you another image, this time of a rabbit and a fly. Study the image for a few seconds, and then I'll ask you a question. Which way was the rabbit facing? If you said to the left, again, you are correct. Now obviously this is probably pretty easy because it was the same rabbit both times and it was facing the same direction, and you knew what the task was. But if you had a sense that it was a little bit easier to answer the second time, it could have also been for another reason. If it seemed a little bit easier for you to remember which way the rabbit was facing when it was next to the fly, well, it may interest you to know that a study had found that people were actually quicker to respond when they were asked about the larger animal in the image. Why should that be the case? Why should it matter if I'm asking a question about the larger or the smaller animal? Well, think about that zoom operation. You can zoom in on your mental image to see something in more detail. And zooming in on your mental image presumably takes time. It doesn't come for free. You have to spend the time to actually zoom in the way you would with a camera, with a lens. The rabbit is smaller than the elephant in the first picture, so it requires more zooming. Therefore, it takes you a little bit longer, and it might take you a little bit longer to answer the question. So here we have a model about mental imagery that says that we zoom in on objects in a visual scene to inspect them. And that gives us a few steps. It gives us an algorithm. Step 1, you have to retrieve the image from your memory. Step 2, you scan the image for the relevant figure. You got to find the rabbit. Step 3, you got to zoom in on that figure. And then step 4, you have to inspect the figure to find out which direction it's facing. So all of those steps take time. And when you're asked about the smaller animal, it requires more time for that step 3, for zooming in. So we have this algorithm. But how can we make predictions about behavior? What links the steps of the algorithm, that process, to a behavior we can actually observe? We need a way of linking those two things together. And that's related to levels of analysis. We need to link our algorithmic model to behavior. We need another model. We need a behavioral model. And in this case, it's pretty simple. We just say each step in the algorithm takes time. And that will allow us to make predictions. Because if you have one step that takes more time than another, then you can predict that it will take that person longer to generate a response. So this algorithm contains several steps. And our behavioral model says that when we perform these steps, it takes time. Performing more steps takes longer. Having to do more work on any particular step will also take longer. That will result in zooming in on the smaller animal in the image taking more time than zooming in on the large animal. And that means that because you took more time to zoom in, it will take you more time to answer the question. So then we can work the reasoning in reverse and say, if we see a person take longer to answer the question, it must be because it took them longer to zoom in on the image. And that tells us something about how we are manipulating those mental images in our mind's eye, what kinds of operations we are performing. It gives us evidence for that particular algorithm. Okay, let's try another experiment. Imagine I give you a map to study with several features on it, like a hill, a lake, a wishing well, a gnarled old tree. Try to remember as much as you can about this map and where things are located. Okay, now bring up the map in your mind's eye. Think of one feature, the wishing well. Now think of another feature, the hut. In your mind's eye, draw a line from the wishing well to the hut. Pretty easy, right? Okay, now do it again. Think of the wishing well. Bring it up in your mind's eye. Draw a line to the boulder at the top of the map. Did both of those things take the same amount of time? Or did it feel like it took a little bit longer to draw a line from the wishing well to the boulder? A study in 1978 found that it took participants longer on average to perform that operation if the features on the map were farther apart. When participants were instructed to draw a line from one point to another, the amount of time that it took to imagine that line traveling across the map was proportionate, almost exactly linearly proportionate, to the distance on the map. Okay, but are there any issues with this? The participants were instructed to imagine the line moving across the map at a constant rate. So in this case, maybe the results are just an artifact of the way the participants were instructed. The question is there a way to control for that? Well, let's think about mental rotation. Suppose I give you two 3D objects at various degrees of rotation. Would you be able to decide if they are the same object? Well, what are some possible ways that we can perform this operation? How can we solve this problem? Figure out if two images match or not? How would a computer perform this rotation operation? Well, I can think of two possible algorithms that can solve this problem. Algorithm 1, we might use Cartesian coordinates. We just track all of the vertices of that three-dimensional figure in some kind of three-dimensional Cartesian space. And then we apply a mathematical transformation to see if the two figures match each other. Of course, I can also imagine another algorithm. In this algorithm, instead of using a Cartesian coordinate system and a mathematical transformation, we will use a 3D mental image, the same type that you might generate in the recognition by components theory. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that three-dimensional mental image and we're going to rotate the image in real time, going through every visual angle until we make a match. So we're looking at an object here, and we're looking at an object here, and we want to know if they're the same. So we have to rotate it in our mind's eye to see if it matches. Okay, but the real question is, can we make different predictions from these two hypotheses? We have two possible algorithms, but we need a theory that links each of these algorithms with some kind of behavior that we can observe. We need a behavioral model. Well, applying mathematical transforms to Cartesian coordinate sets is going to take time. And mental rotation is also going to take some time. Any kind of mental operation you do takes time. But if we use math, it really shouldn't matter how much rotation there is. It shouldn't matter how far apart the two figures are in terms of rotation. Applying that Cartesian transform applies to the same number of coordinates either way, right? Each object is made of the same number of coordinates. So we have to do the same amount of math no matter how far apart they are. But if we're using mental imagery and we apply some kind of actual rotation, it might actually take longer if the difference between the two is greater. So if rotation takes time, then doing more rotation will take more time. So it will matter what degree of rotation the two figures display. In a study in 1971, Shepard and Metzler did exactly this experiment, and what they found was that image identification tracked almost perfectly linearly with the degree of rotation. If we had used Cartesian math, then all of these should have taken the same amount of time. The fact that we're using mental rotation means that the bigger differences actually do take us longer. As difference in angles increases, reaction time also increases. So it takes us a lot longer to determine if two objects are the same or different, if their angular difference is great, as opposed to if their angular difference is very small. This is good evidence that we are actually doing some kind of mental rotation in our mind's eye. We actually are representing the images as three-dimensional objects and then rotating them in real time to see if they match. So this pattern of increasing reaction time with increasing angular difference is fantastic evidence that shows us not only what kind of algorithm we are using, but also the representation, the way that we are representing these objects in our mind. So not only do we actively use mental imagery, we're applying transformations to these mental images that seem very similar to physical transformations, to the transformations we might apply to physical objects, rotating them or zooming in and out. And these inferences can be made by applying models to make predictions about behavior and then testing those predictions, which is an important part of how cognitive science has functioned for decades. Okay, I want to review some key concepts from this lecture. We talked about several theories of object recognition, including template matching, using exemplars from memory to compare to what we are seeing now to see if they match. We talked about recognition by components, taking images of things in the world, converting them into three-dimensional models using primitive shapes called geons. And we talked about feature integration, which is really about detecting things in noise or detecting objects among distractors, kind of the Where's Waldo problem. We talked about parallel versus serial processing. Certain processes we can do many steps at the same time. We saw this with feature integration. If we're trying to find Waldo and he is extremely different from everything around him, if there's only a single feature that we actually need to pay attention to, then we can scan an entire image in one step and the image will pop out to us. If there's more than one feature different, then we'll have to scan each object one at a time. We have to do a serial process, and that takes a lot longer. We also talked about the transformations that we can apply to our mental images, things like panning, scanning, zooming, and especially mental rotation. And how we can use experiments with behavioral models to see those differences and to make inferences about what we're doing inside our mind's eye, how we're manipulating information, imagistic representations, to make sense of the world around us. Our next lecture, we're going to talk more about sensation and perception, but we're going to move this to another sensory modality. We're going to talk about audition. We're going to talk about hearing. We're going to talk about it specifically in the context of trying to make sense out of spoken language. How do we understand what other people are saying?